Selena stood on the rugged coastline of Carmel, by the sea, her eyes locked on the horizon, where the crashing waves seemed to echo the turmoil within her. The once soothing sound of the Pacific Ocean, which had brought her comfort as a child growing up in this small town, now only amplified the sense of isolation she felt. She had always loved Carmel, a place where time seemed to stand still, but now it felt like a prison her own life stuck in a never-ending loop of frustration and unspoken despair. At 27, Selena found herself questioning every decision she had made, especially her marriage. She had met Jason, her husband, in what seemed like a fateful encounter at a community event 2 years ago. He was working at the garage, his hands always covered in grease, fixing cars for the locals who adored him for his reliability. He had a steady job, a calm demeanor, and a soft smile that gave her hope for stability, something she had yearned for in her tumultuous life. His Chinese-American heritage, mixed with the deep-rooted values of his family, intrigued her at first. The blend of cultures, the traditions, the idea of building something solid together, it all felt right. Until it didn't. As Selena reminisced about the early days of their marriage, she could still recall the hopeful glow in her heart. They had moved into a modest 2-bedroom house just outside of town. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The nights they spent cooking simple meals together, laughing over spilled ingredients, and making plans for the future were some of the best memories she had. But as time went on, the laughter faded, replaced by a growing tension neither of them could ignore. Selena shifted her weight on the sand, thinking about Jason's family. His mother, Linda, had always been kind to her, at least on the surface. A modern American woman in every sense, Linda was involved in yoga, community meetings, and charity events. She was polite and welcoming, but Selena always sensed a distance between them, like an invisible wall that neither of them acknowledged but both knew existed. Beneath Linda's warm smiles and kind gestures, there was an unspoken expectation, a desire for grandchildren that weighed heavily on Selena's shoulders. Her father-in-law Wei was a different story. At 52, he was a man of few words but many opinions. He had built a life in America after moving from China as a young man, working his way up from construction jobs to becoming a manager at a machine shop. Though retired now, Wei still carried the aura of a patriarch, and his silent scrutiny felt like a constant judgment. He believed in the importance of family lineage, of passing down the family name. And with Jason being the only son, the pressure to continue that legacy fell squarely on Selena. The real fracture in their marriage, however, lay deeper than family expectations. It was in the unspoken truths that neither Selena nor Jason wanted to confront. Selena had tried to ignore the issue for as long as she could, hoping that things would improve over time. But after 2 years of marriage, their intimacy was still fraught with disappointment. Jason, despite his strong appearance, struggled with premature ejaculation. Every attempt at intimacy left Selena feeling more disconnected, her heart heavy with unfulfilled desires. It wasn't just about sex. It was about the growing chasm between them, the inability to communicate, and the quiet resentment that built up like a slow-burning fire. The pressure to have children had only exacerbated the problem. With each passing month, the weight of expectation from Jason's family grew heavier. His younger sister, Emily, was still in college, her own life ahead of her, far from the responsibilities of marriage and children. That left Selena and Jason to bear the burden of continuing the family line. But how could they, when the very foundation of their relationship seemed to be crumbling? Selena sighed as she thought about the countless nights she had lain awake, listening to the rhythmic sound of Jason's breathing beside her, wondering how they had gotten to this point. Jason never talked about it. He avoided the topic like it was a storm he could outrun, throwing himself into his work at the garage instead. But Selena knew he felt it too, the silent judgment, the disappointment. And in his silence, their distance grew. So there had been moments when Selena considered leaving, packing up and walking away from the life they had built. She had even imagined what it might be like to return to the life she had before meeting Jason, to the days when her only concerns were paying bills and making ends meet at the supermarket. But something always held her back. Maybe it was the hope that things could get better, Or perhaps it was the fear of failure, the fear of admitting that the life she had dreamed of was slipping through her fingers. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the small living room, Selena heard the door creak open. Jason walked in, looking exhausted as usual, his overalls stained with oil and grime. He didn't say much, just nodded in her direction and disappeared into the bathroom. This was their new routine: minimal conversation, the bare minimum of interaction, as if they were two strangers sharing a space rather than a married couple. Selena stared at the laundry in her hands, her fingers tightening around the fabric. She wanted to scream, to cry, to shake Jason out of his silence, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. They had drifted too far apart, and neither of them knew how to find their way back. That night, after dinner, they sat in the living room, the TV on but neither of them really watching. The air was thick with the tension that had become their constant companion. Selena took a deep breath, deciding that something had to change. She couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in a marriage that was slowly suffocating her, burdened by the weight of unspoken expectations. "Jason," she said, her voice breaking the silence between them. He looked up, surprised by the suddenness of her voice. "Yeah? We need to talk, really talk." Jason's eyes clouded with apprehension, but he nodded, turning off the TV. "Okay." Selena didn't know where to start, but she knew this conversation was long overdue. They couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, not when their marriage was unraveling right in front of them. As they sat there, facing each other for what felt like the first time in months, Selena realized that this was the moment that would define the rest of their lives. They could either confront their problems head-on and try to rebuild what was broken, or they could let the silence between them destroy everything. And for the first time in a long time, Selena felt a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. But it would take more than words. It would take a willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. One autumn evening, as the sky outside slowly turned purple and dry leaves began to fall sparsely on the road ahead, the entire house was filled with an unusual silence. My husband and I had just finished dinner when his parents called us over, sitting together on the light gray sofa. They sat across from us, looking very solemn, as if they were preparing for an important conversation. The tension spread throughout the room even before anyone spoke. My mother-in-law, in a gentle yet serious tone, suggested that we should visit the doctor to check if there was anything wrong, since our childlessness had become a major concern for her. Although I had mentally prepared for this conversation for a long time, I still couldn't avoid feeling anxious. Sitting in silence, I looked down at my hands, feeling heavy as she continued to talk about wanting to ensure that everything was fine and that no one had any serious issues. Her words were soft, but I understood deep down that she was subtly implying something about my fertility. At that moment, a strange sense of shame washed over me, as if everything was my fault. My husband, with a tense face, sat up straight and immediately rejected her suggestion. He firmly stated that we didn't need any tests. His tone was a bit harsh, and I knew this was his way of protecting his pride. He didn't want to admit that there might be something wrong with him. Every time I brought up the topic, he would avoid it or brush it off as if it wasn't worth worrying about. But the truth was, the issue of not having a child had become a huge shadow hanging over our lives. My in-laws fell silent, looking at him as if trying to understand, but no one said anything more. The atmosphere in the room gradually became more suffocating, as if all words had condensed into a heavy silence. I sat there, feeling like I was caught between two worlds. On one side, there was the responsibility of a wife to bear a child and continue the family line. On the other side, there was my husband, who refused to face reality, leaving me lost, not knowing what to do. As time went on, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. Every meal became tense. Every time I saw my in-laws, I felt an invisible pressure pressing down on me. Their questions about my health, their words of encouragement, were no longer acts of concern but knives cutting deep into the fear within me. Not having children had become a hidden wound, growing worse with each passing day. Then one evening in September 2021, a day I vividly remember because of what happened next, which completely changed my life. That day, my husband had a work party, so he came home late. My mother-in-law had her usual yoga class with her friends, leaving me alone at home with my father-in-law. Before that night, I had never thought that he could be a danger to me. In my mind, he was simply a family member, though our relationship had never been particularly close. After a long day at work, I took a shower and changed into a short dress, simply because I wanted to feel comfortable at home. I went to the kitchen, preparing dinner as usual, not giving it much thought. It was just a normal meal between two family members. When I walked into the living room, I noticed my father-in-law sitting in the armchair, his eyes looking at me strangely. His gaze was slightly narrowed, observing me with a look that I couldn't quite decipher. At that moment, I didn't pay much attention to it. I just thought he might be tired after a long day. I called him to come for dinner, as usual. He stood up, slowly walking into the kitchen. Everything seemed normal, but there was an uneasiness in my heart that I couldn't explain. While we sat at the table eating, neither of us spoke much. I tried to maintain a relaxed atmosphere, but the silence between us grew increasingly oppressive. Suddenly, he looked up and stared directly at me. "Have you ever thought that this might not just be about health or medical issues?" he asked, his voice thoughtful and low. His question took me by surprise. I didn't understand what he meant. I forced a light smile, responding softly, "I'm not sure what you're getting at." My father-in-law held my gaze for a long moment before continuing. "Sometimes people need to consider other things that science cannot explain." His words drifted through my ears like a cold breeze. I couldn't quite grasp what he was implying, but the atmosphere suddenly became even more stifling. After dinner, I quickly cleaned up and found a way to avoid being around him. The feeling of unease continued to grow, but I didn't know what to do. That night, I went up to my room earlier than usual, locked the door tightly, and sat on the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes stared out the window, but my mind was spinning with chaotic thoughts. From that evening on, whenever I was alone in the house with my father-in-law, I always felt anxious. The suffocating pressure came not only from the issue of having a child, but also from something invisible, yet far more terrifying. My life was no longer the same, and I began to realize that terrible things could start from the smallest, most unnoticed moments. After the meal, I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes. The space around me was quiet, except for the sound of water running from the faucet. I was focused on my task, unaware that the worst was about to happen. Suddenly, a pair of arms wrapped around my waist, holding me tightly from behind. Startled, I turned around in panic, and the person standing before me was none other than my father-in-law. At that moment, I didn't know how to react. My mind was in turmoil, unable to believe that this could actually be happening. I wanted to scream, to push him away, but my mouth was covered by his rough hand. I couldn't escape, and every plea of mine seemed to disappear into the depths of fear. He held me tightly, and while I was still in shock, he whispered something horrifying in my ear. "I'll help you have a child," he said coldly. Immediately, a chill ran down my spine. His words filled me with disgust, but I was powerless, unable to do anything. Before I could react, everything unfolded. It all happened so quickly and violently, I had no time to resist. The feeling at that moment was terrifying. My whole body went numb. I could only stand there, allowing everything to happen without the strength to stop it. When it was over, I collapsed, holding my head in my hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Shame, disgust, and fear overwhelmed me, almost suffocating me. My father-in-law, with a cold and calm expression, merely said that he did this for the happiness of the family. Then, he stood up and walked away as if nothing had happened, leaving me in chaos and despair. That night, I didn't dare tell my husband. I didn't know how to face this. I was afraid that if I spoke up, things would spiral out of control and our marriage would be beyond saving. I chose to remain silent, suppressing the pain and fear inside, pretending that nothing had happened. But after that first time, nothing was the same. I tried to live a normal life. keeping things going as if nothing was unusual. But every time I faced my father-in-law, I couldn't shake the overwhelming fear. His gaze had changed. It was no longer the indifferent, calm look it once was. Every time we crossed paths, I could sense a new look in his eyes, one filled with desire, a look I had never seen before. That look confused me, frightened me, but also drew me deeper into a spiral of guilt and torment from which I could not escape. One evening, not long after that first time, my husband had to work late, and my mother-in-law went to her usual yoga class. I stayed home feeling uneasy. The fear of being alone with my father-in-law always haunted me. That evening, when he walked into the house, I knew the worst was about to happen again. This time, there was no more avoiding glances or pretense. He walked straight toward me, and before I knew it, I was pulled into a room. Everything happened so fast that I didn't have time to react or resist. The door slammed shut behind us. In the confined space, I could feel his heavy breath near my ear. This time he was much more forceful, till my weak resistance only seemed to encourage him further. I tried to push him away, but my attempts only brought him closer, forcing me to accept the fact that there was no escape. What shocked me, even in that moment of terror, was his skill. My father-in-law, despite being 52, possessed a strength and prowess that I had never seen in my husband. My husband, though tall and strong in appearance, had always been weak and hurried in intimacy, gradually leaving me disappointed and distant. But my father-in-law, on the other hand, knew exactly what to do. Every move, every touch, was full of control and power. I didn't want to admit it, but deep inside, I felt something I had never felt with my husband: pleasure mixed with guilt, fear combined with shame. I didn't know what to do. I only knew that I had been drawn into something I could not free myself from. After that, everything became a blur. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but deep down, I knew that I had changed. Each time I encountered my father-in-law, his gaze terrified me, but at the same time, I felt trapped in a sense of helpless attraction to this impossible situation. My life became a series of haunted, painful days. I couldn't tell anyone, couldn't share with anyone what was happening. Every night I lay next to my husband, watching him sleep soundly, my heart heavy with guilt. Would he ever know the truth? Would I ever have the courage to speak out? I was lost, unable to find a way out, and that made me sink deeper into my own darkness. But what I didn't anticipate was that one evening, my husband unexpectedly came home early and discovered. The narrator quietly followed her every step through the silent house, where the walls seemed to know the secret she was trying so hard to conceal. After everything was over, she sat down, her heart weighed down with guilt, while her father-in-law, acted as if nothing had happened, as if it were a natural occurrence, a part of life she was forced to accept. As calmness filled her with both anger and helplessness. She once thought she could escape this entanglement, but there was a mysterious allure between them that refused to let her go. Every time they crossed paths, the air between them seemed to thicken with tension, but there was also an inexplicable pull drawing her toward him, even though her mind knew it was wrong. At first, the relationship had been a mistake, a single moment of weakness, but it quickly became a spiral from which she could not break free. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but it was as if both of them were powerless to stop. The more she tried to run, the deeper she was drawn into this relationship. As the days passed, she lost control of her emotions, drowning in regret and the guilt that she couldn't shake off. Then, a year later, she gave birth to a son, the child her husband's family had been waiting for so long. For everyone, it was a source of joy, a sign that the family was now complete. But for her, the child was an obsession, the result of a terrible secret she had to bear alone. Each time she held her baby in her arms, she felt the weight of her heart's burden. She often wondered if the child could somehow sense the truth of his origin. The innocent look in his eyes sometimes drove her into a spiral of inner torment, a mixture of love and unbearable pain. After the birth, she and her husband moved into their own home. The arrival of their child seemed to bring her husband some joy and peace, but she knew that an invisible wall now stood between them. The closeness and intimacy they once shared had completely disappeared. Every time she looked into his eyes, she felt as if she were hiding something unforgivable. Her mind was constantly tormented by guilt, a daily pain that gnawed at her. She couldn't tell her husband the truth. She knew that if she confessed, everything would fall apart: their life, their family, their children, everything would collapse. She lacked the courage to face that consequence. Instead of revealing the truth, she chose to keep it all to herself, to bury the pain deep inside, and live in suffocating silence. Each day she had to pretend that everything was fine, that she wasn't carrying a terrible secret. But deep down, she always felt the rift between them. Even though her husband didn't know, she still felt that she had betrayed him, not just physically but mentally as well. She told herself that if he knew the truth, he would never forgive her, and she would lose everything she was trying to protect. One afternoon, as the weak sunlight poured into their small house, she sat by the window, watching her son play. Her heart broke as she thought about his future. If the truth were revealed, would he still be loved as he was now? Would their family remain intact? The thought squeezed her heart, but she couldn't find a way to escape the spiral of guilt. Then, one day, while her husband was away, her father-in-law came to visit. When the door opened, the tension between them was as thick as ever. He stepped inside, his expression calm, as though nothing was unusual. But she knew exactly what was going on inside her heart. She tried to keep her distance, but his gaze still made her uneasy. He sat down opposite her, silent for a moment, before starting a conversation. "How's the baby?" he asked, his voice steady but with something hidden beneath. "He's doing well," she replied, trying not to show any emotion. The space around them seemed to be swallowed by silence, and she could clearly feel the tension engulfing them both. He stood up, walking closer to her, and her heart began to race. Even though she knew it was wrong, she still couldn't stop the strange pull toward him. He lightly touched her shoulder, and she immediately pulled away, overwhelmed by fear and shame. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. "It's enough. I can't live like this anymore." He looked at her, his eyes deep, then nodded. "I understand," he said quietly. "But you know, the truth will always be the truth. No matter how much we try to hide, it will always be there." His words pierced her like a knife. She knew he was right. The truth couldn't be buried forever. But did she have the strength to face it? In the days that followed, she lived in constant turmoil. She asked herself hundreds of times, should she confess everything to her husband? But every time the thought surfaced, the fear of losing everything held her back. She knew that, with one confession, everything would come crashing down. She stood at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. The weight of her secret was slowly crushing her, but she couldn't bear the thought of losing her family. All she could do was ask herself in agony, should she reveal the truth or continue to keep silent forever?